Hello, Steve. How are you today?
I'm good, Leanne. How are you?
I am good, thank you. It's time for another episode of Divorce Explained. And this week, I think we have a really helpful topic, although it is one of the topics in family law that is probably one of the most contested or contentious issues. And that is the issue of spousal support and how it is determined and how it is calculated. And it's an issue that it's not black and white. Generally, anyone who's paying spousal support doesn't want to pay spousal support. Often people accept that they have to pay child support, but they feel a little bit differently about spousal support. And it's calculated differently than child support. The considerations are different. And that's what makes it one of the more contentious issues in family law. So why don't we start with Steve, if you want to tell listeners a little bit about the considerations that we have, what we look at when we're determining whether someone might be eligible for spousal support.
100%. And I can tell you, of all the areas of family law, when we think about parenting, when we think about property division, matrimonial homes, pensions, the most vexing area of family law is spousal support. And the question becomes, why? Why isn't that just as complicated or just as easy as all the other ones? Answer, it's the most ambiguous one. It's the most gray one. It's the one that's most open to views, arguments, refutations, protestations, morality, social norms, the behavior of people, the choices they've made. At the end of the day, nobody really cares what choice you made while you bought the matrimonial home. It's got to be divided. Nobody cares why you got that job when it comes to determining child support. On spousal support, it matters. And so we've had so many arguments over the last 30 plus years on spousal support. And then we've got arguments because of the changing social norms. Should women pay spousal support to a lower earning husband? Some would say, no way. But the laws of spousal support or alimony or maintenance, by the way, very archaic terms, very patriarchal terms, were once created for women, to protect women, to care for women who often left relationships financially disadvantaged. So those laws are now being used for men who are disadvantaged as a result of leaving a higher earning female partner or a wife. And so we're going to talk about those considerations that you just asked me about, but I can't help but want to talk about sort of the pop culture part of alimony and where that fits into this in 2025. And I was just wondering, what do you think about those sort of non-legalistic considerations?
Well, I have, what some people might consider a controversial viewpoint on spousal support or alimony. In 2025, on some level, I question, whether in a lot of cases, if it is something that is necessary. Historically, where we had the traditional family unit and the traditional model where the woman stayed at home and raised the children, gave up her career, and the man worked outside the home, it seemed to me that there was very much a role. The women were disadvantaged financially, and for them to not get any support when the marriage ended was putting them into some, very financially poor situations. Whereas here in 2025, it's different. I mean, most women, or a lot of women, work outside the home. We do still have some traditional families, and in those situations, I think that spousal support needs to be looked at. But most women work outside the home. As you mentioned, Steve, many women are the bigger breadwinner in the home. And I think we have to, if we're prepared to accept spousal support, we have to be prepared to pay it too. But in some ways, I wonder whether a model that we're all responsible for ourselves on some level, particularly if there's no children, whether that should be the situation. And if you choose to work less or choose a career path that doesn't pay as well, then the consequences of that choice that you have a lower income. Whereas if you choose a career path that making money is important to you and you're willing to take on the stress and the long hours of making that money, then maybe that advantage should be for you. Why do you have to pay someone else who made different choices? And I mean, that's controversial, but 2025 is much different than when some of these cases were decided and the spousal support regime was originally developed.
I'll tell you, there's 2 points I want to make on the social side, and then we'll get into the legal side of it. But point number one, it's so funny that you use the phraseology work out of the house, because that was a word that was common prior to COVID. And yet there's a lot of fathers and mothers, husbands and wives or spouses that are working out of the house in the house because of hybrid work situations. But point well taken. But the reason I bring that up is because most of the social science literature that I have read is even when the two parents earn the same amount of money, the mother ends up putting in more hours in domestic duties, whether that means cooking, cleaning, caring for the children, picking them up when they're sick at school, and so on and so forth. So, and that's in a situation where their incomes are exactly the same, like, for example, two teachers. But in situations where the mother is earning less than the father, almost always we see that the domestic responsibilities are borne by the mother or the wife more so. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even in situations where the wife earns more than the husband, the science is showing, the statistics are showing, she bears more of the domestic responsibilities, which one would think, shouldn't it flip? But it doesn't. So in other words, we've got a world right now where in a heterosexual relationship, whether they're married or otherwise, irrespective of the income disparity, the women end up bearing more of the domestic responsibilities, which takes us to the theory underneath spousal support, maintenance, and alimony law, which is when a couple splits up, there needs to be some equitable distribution of family income to allow both spouses to live the same level of living as they did when they were together and commingling their income. The other point I wanted to make, and this is interesting, when we talk about touching the chord of morality or what are the social norms, I recently had a situation where I was asked to negotiate a prenup on behalf of a woman who was about to marry. Now, the woman that I was helping was financially successful, independent. She earned a fair income and had her own assets. She was marrying a man who, whatever her success was, his was far greater. He, unlike her, was previously married. He, unlike her, went through a bitter divorce. And as their relationship was maturing, he, no fault on him, wanted a prenup. He didn't want to have to go through another ugly divorce. Understandable. Where the rubber hit the pavement was the difference in views on spousal support. They didn't disagree on whatever they own, they keep owning. They didn't disagree on whatever they grow with their money, they keep. They disagreed on spousal support. And of course, for our viewers, you can't contract out of child support, or you can't contract to a parenting schedule before kids are born. But you can contract out of spousal support. He wanted an agreement that said zero spousal support under any circumstance. My client was in her early 30s. She wanted to have children. And I said to her, if you contract out of spousal support at 30 and you come knocking on my door when you're 55 and you say for the last 25 years, you gave up your job or you reduced your job significantly to raise children, and now you've got 3 children, and you were living on a lifestyle of $500,000 a year, and now you've got no income and child support, and of course you've got some assets that you had when you got married. This spousal support release in the prenup will be very detrimental to you. You're going to go from living at this level to this level. And the spousal support release in the prenup might stand up, probably will stand up, because it was negotiated with lawyers with your eyes wide open. And I said, this is a real problem. This ended up going back and forth. And at the end of the day, my retainer terminated on my recommendation to this woman that if it's going to be that, I cannot be involved, because in my view, it was detrimental and she may not have been thinking straight. And she shared with me privately that she was on the verge of ending the relationship. And so I don't know what happened, but I can tell you, I am proud of the advice that I gave her, because it really does touch on social norms where they intersect with the legalities of spousal support.
Yeah, absolutely. Spousal support waivers are a common thing that we see presented in marriage contracts or prenuptial agreements. And it is certainly something where if someone is going to make sacrifices to their, financial or their ability to earn an income by being home more for children, which is good for the family quite often, there should be some level of compensation for that. And that's, the reason, one of the reasons why we have the spousal support. And if somebody's wanting you to sign or wanting a client to sign a marriage contract or a prenup that doesn't take that into account, I think that in that situation, that person has to really reflect on, what does this other person really feel about me? If that's their position, that they would be so willing to toss me out with nothing and children potentially down the road. It's a cause to really re-examine a relationship in that type of circumstance.
I had another case that's kind of funny, and it was another prenup, and it said that if they break up under 5 years, there will be no spousal support. Okay, that's sort of reasonable, maybe. But if you break up after 5 years, you get a certain amount of money for all the years you were together, including the first 5. And if you break up after 10 years, the number goes up, and so on and so forth. So what ended up happening? The client, in this case, the woman who would have been the recipient of spousal support if they broke up after 5 years, comes to me and says, he just told me that he is breaking up with me because we're about to celebrate our 5-year anniversary. Yeah. And then he wants to get back together in order to trigger the waiver of spousal support and start all over again.
Wow.
I love the guy. Smart move on him. But what a jerk.
Yeah.
She asked me what to do. I said, there's not much you can. He has the right, just like you do, to end a relationship. But you have the right to take him back or not. And maybe the next time you sign a prenup, instead of it being a 5-year stopgap, you have a no stopgap in order to ensure his commitment to you greater than his commitment to his wallet.
Well, and I've heard of that happening because in situations where you have a common law couple, because as our listeners may not know, if a couple lives common law, so they're not legally married, but they are living together in an intimate relationship. If they live together for a period of at least 3 years, then possibly there could be an entitlement to spousal support. But if it's less than 3 years, unless you have, it could be more complicated if you have a child and whatnot. But without children, if you live together for less than 3 years, then there isn't an entitlement to spousal support. And I've heard of people who just live with somebody for 2 years, 2.5 years, and then break it up because they know they're getting, close to that 3-year mark. So I couldn't imagine living that way, but there are people out there who do it.
Well, I'll tell you, we live in an information era. So people, could be lying in their bed at 4 a.m. and Googling, when am I a support when do I have to pay support and so forth. So there's all these articles and podcasts like ours that inform people about what their rights are and which triggers their behaviors. So let's take this right back to first principles. The subject matter is understanding spousal support. How is it determined? So let's start with the definition. What's a spouse? Answer. If you're in Canada and you are married, you're a spouse. If you're divorced, you're no longer a spouse. If you are not married and you are living common law, which is a whole long definition, but let's just call it what most people think, which is living together in a spouse-like or marriage-like relationship. You share a bed, you share a home, you share a life. If you two adults are spouses, not roommates, spouses, after 3 years of continuous cohabitation, it triggers the right to seek spousal support. Doesn't mean you have to pay it, but you have the right to at least ask for it. But if you've been married, if you've been cohabiting for 35 months, you're not even entitled to ask. If you have a child in common for a day, a week, a month, 20 years, you're a spouse under provincial law. So, child in common, which could include adopted, living together for 3 years continuously, if you're not married, or married, you can be married for one day, any one of those triggers the label spouse. And if it triggers the label spouse, it therefore triggers the right of spousal support. And then come the factors, and the factors are long. And so let's start with some of the basic ones. Age, health, career, education, how much of an investment you made in the other person's career, which could include, by the way, literally helping them build their business. It could include funding their tuition while they became, a rock star MBA on Bay Street, or it could just be funding their education to become a massage therapist. And so there's a fairly long list, and I would recommend anybody that wants to look at the total list, go to the Family Law Act of Ontario and scroll to section 33 sub 9, where it lists a really long list, including things like taking care of children, cohabitation, housekeeping, caring for family members, whether somebody moved to help somebody else, whether somebody had mental health problems. Really, really long list, which, like I said at the very beginning of the show, is the very reason why you see so many of these cases in court, because everybody's got a narrative.
No, absolutely. Everyone has a narrative, and it's something that, everyone feels or often feel like they made a sacrifice of some sort for their relationship. And so they want to be compensated for it. And so that's something that they come to us, and they're often seeking. But just because somebody meets the definition of a spouse, and just because somebody can ask for spousal support or make a claim for spousal support, does not mean that they are going to be found to be entitled to spousal support. That's a different issue, and again, a complicated one. But in order to successfully make that claim, there's certain legal criteria that someone is going to have to establish in order to convince a judge that they meet those criteria and should be entitled to spousal support.
And that's precisely right. So, academically speaking, under the category of law now, we've got 3 sub issues that always need to be considered when we're having a conversation about spousal support. 1 is entitlement, 2 is duration, and 3 is quantum. If the answer to the first one is no, he or she is not entitled, for example, because they don't meet the definition, or because there wasn't any of the factors met for entitlement, then we don't even go to 2 and 3. But if the answer is yes to entitlement, then we go on to 2 and 3. And if you go to Section 33 of the Family Law Act or Section 15.1 of the Divorce Act, the Family Law Act for people that are married and unmarried, and the Divorce Act only for people that are married and not divorced, you'll find the criteria there to calculate, to consider the quantum and the duration. Now, I want to point out for the viewers, a lot of people make this huge mistake. They go online, they Google, do I have to pay spousal support? They end up finding the spousal support calculator. Then they run the numbers, and they then think that those numbers are what they either get or have to pay. The problem with that is they have skipped over the first factor, entitlement. They may think they have to pay that amount for that period of time without having properly considered whether they're even liable. And that's why this is one of those topics where anybody that really wants to know the bottom line needs to get proper legal advice from a lawyer to determine all 3, not just the last 2 factors.
Absolutely. And I think that part of the mistake that you just talked about, Steve, part of the reason that happens is lots of people understand that we have the federal child support guidelines and provincial child support guidelines, and people can Google that. And for incomes under $150,000, it's fairly straightforward in a lot of ways how to, use those guidelines to figure out how much child support somebody needs to pay. And so then we have something called the Spousal Support Advisory Guidelines. And a lot of people think that those are exactly the same as the child support guidelines. And so you just put incomes in and away you go, you've got a number. But they're not the same. First of all, they're not. They're just what they say, a guideline, versus the child support guidelines, which are much more sort of strongly followed.
The A in SAG is advisory, not mandatory.
Exactly. Whereas the child support guidelines are a mandatory thing. So that's one of the big mistakes. So they are an advisory number that maybe can give a general idea of what spousal support might look like. But there's many other factors that have to get looked at that go back to the issue of entitlement before we're and even determining quantum. Again, they're on the spousal support advisory guidelines. There's low, mid, and high. And so it has to be determined if someone does have that entitlement to spousal support, where do they fall in that low, mid, and high? And then, of course, the final issue, duration.
Yeah, these are, like I said, these are complicated issues. It's partly social, partly qualitative, partly quantitative. It's a combination of all of the above. And let's not forget, there's a very large issue of morality and fairness when it comes to spousal support. And some will say, it's not fair that I have to pay that much. And some will say, it's not fair that she or he earns that much and I only get such and such. So spousal support definitely invokes a lot of views on the fairness of the outcome. Another topic within spousal support is the notion of lump sum. Very popular topic. People ask, can I just get a lump sum? Can I just pay a lump sum? Which right away kicks us into this whole discussion about, wait for it, taxes. Because child support, tax-free, paid with after-tax dollars. Spousal support, it's taxable to the person getting it. It's tax deductible to the person paying it. And if it, of course, is in a written agreement and periodic. But if it's not periodic, meaning if it's not weekly or monthly or whatnot, if it's not periodic, if it's paid in one lump sum, It's tax-free to the recipient, and it's not deductible to the person paying it. Where do we see this? Very popular. Where? When a couple splits up and one of them wants to keep the matrimonial home. And the one that wants to keep the matrimonial home is the lower earning spouse. So let's just use an example. 2 children, husband, wife. Husband makes 200, wife makes 50. They split up. There's $500,000 in an equity in the matrimonial home. So normally they would walk away with $250 each. Wife says to husband, through lawyers or mediation, rather than selling the home, let me keep the home. Now, I can't give you your $250 out of the $500 in equity, but rather you are going to be paying me X amount of money over the next X years in spousal support. If we were to crunch that number all the way down to a lump sum, that lump sum will either be almost or less more than the equity in the home. So in exchange for me keeping the home and me giving you $250, which is half the equity, I will take the house in exchange for me giving you a spousal support release. Wife gets the house. Husband doesn't have to pay spousal support. He keeps his income. She keeps the house. And there's a waiver of spousal support. And some of the viewers will hear this word called Miglin, because there was a case called Miglin and Miglin where somebody challenged a release. And now we call it the Miglin release. And a Miglin release is, back to my example, where the wife keeps the house and gives the husband a release. He never pays it. She keeps the house and doesn't get it. And that's the end of spousal support.
Yeah, and as listeners can probably tell from what you just explained, Steve, because these issues can be complicated because of the tax considerations as well, it's really important that you get proper legal advice when you're dealing with spousal support. And I just wanted to touch on the issue of duration and offer a very, very general guideline about how we look at when we're determining duration. And again, this is just a very general rule of thumb for information purposes, that generally spousal support is to be paid for 50% of the length of the relationship to the full length of the relationship. However, if it is a long-term relationship, then it quite possibly could be indefinite spousal support with no cutoff date. And again, depending on the circumstances of the recipient, like for example, if they have reasons why they can't work, if they have medical conditions or mental health issues that prevent them from working, somebody could end up having to pay spousal support indefinitely, even on a shorter relationship in certain circumstances.
And what you're speaking of is this thing called the Rule of 65, or as the author Rolly Thompson sometimes calls it, the Principle of 65. It's not a hard and fast rule, but the idea is if the age at separation of the recipient spouse plus the length of the relationship adds up to 65 or more, there's no upper cap on the duration. There's been a lot of discussion and debate as to whether that is a hard rule or a soft rule, but suffice it to say, in situations where, say, a 50-year-old woman who has been married for 15 years breaks up, 15 plus 50 is 65. The idea is that spousal support doesn't have a duration that is half of 15 or even all of 15. It could be greater than that. So there's a lot of different considerations. I'm going to just throw one more out there that causes people a lot of confusion, and then we're going to wrap up. When it comes to the laws of child support and spousal support, they do intersect. Because in many cases, when people split up, there's still minor children. And when there's minor children, there's 2 types of support that need to be considered. The law requires child support to be considered before spousal support. In other words, first we determine incomes, then we determine child support, then we determine spousal support. But this is where mistakes are often made. Where there is a need to consider child support first, by definition, there's a need to consider Section 7 expenses, things like private school camps, medical expenses, after-school programs, all of those things that fall under Section 7 of the Child Support Guidelines need to be considered first. Many times, there are significant Section 7 expenses. And the people that go onto these online calculators completely miss the boat because they then calculate spousal support as though there's no Section 7 expenses. And that creates a very false number. And so I just want to point out that, we've seen a lot of trials and tribulations on do-it-yourself spousal support calculations, whether there's mistakes regarding taxation, mistakes regarding entitlement, mistakes regarding duration, and mistakes regarding one's invoking their own morality on what's right and what's wrong. These are all things that we have seen, and I encourage any listener to ensure that before you arrive at a conclusion on this topic, you get proper legal advice. Of course, as usual, whatever Leanne and I said today was not legal advice. It was just legal information. So that wraps up our program on understanding spousal support and how it's determined. And we will see you all next week.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.